Chapter 7 Social Studies. Spring was coming. Its advent was heralded by the rounding up of the horses on top of the mountain range, and their arrival in the valley ready for the activities of the summer. In the late autumn, the horses are driven up the mountains and left there so that they can move freely and forage for themselves during the winter. Some of them fall victims to wolves and cougars, and some slip into gulches, breaking their legs, and are devoured by the coyotes. They all become very thin. In the spring, they are rounded up together with the colts that have been born on the range and are brought down the mountainside. Henry and Annie went riding past the school one morning, followed by Patsy, the collie, and her pup, and for the rest of the day it was difficult to keep the children's eyes from the windows. But it was not until late afternoon that the party returned, riding into the sunset. Annie was leading, followed by a belled horse. Streaming after them, with flowing manes and tails, came the long line of horses driven by Henry and young Alfie. A few days later, Ralph came to school with the news that the rancher at the Big Bar Ranch, Mr. Cromie, was going to dehorn his cattle on Saturday, and asked if I would like to go and watch the operation. I had noticed that the Hereford cattle, which I had seen about the mountain pastures, were hornless, and I had assumed that in some way they were bred hornless. Ralph arrived at my cabin door about 8 o'clock on the Saturday morning, leading a horse for me to ride. It was a lovely breezy morning as we rode towards the river, with the sky a brilliant blue and the regimented peaks still tipped and streaked with snow. Alongside the creek, which roared below us, the pussy willows were budded with silver, and there were already a few blades of green sprouting among the withered gray of the winter grass. After a ride of 4 or 5 miles, we came within sight of the Big Bar Ranch, with the Fraser Canyon beyond it. We could see that the river was still fringed with ice. The cowboys had been out since dawn, rounding up the cattle, and as they began to come in, Ralph and Arthur and I chose points of vantage from which to view the proceedings. I elected to sit on the top rail of an empty corral, but was ordered off, and I soon discovered why. The cattle were assembled in one of the corrals, from which a chute, admitting the animals in a single file, led to the branding corral. This passage ended in a gate, the top half of which could be raised by lifting one of the rails. Henry stood holding this top half open. Cowboys straddled the top rails of the chute and induced the first victim to advance and look over the lower half of the gate, when Henry immediately dropped the top half, which had a semicircular opening in it to fit the beast's neck, and its head was held in a vise. The cowboys had to be agile because the beasts were wild, and as time went on, they became increasingly obstinate and terrified and were liable to leap upwards, threshing their forelimbs through the gaps between the rails. Mr. Cromie now held the nose of the animal with the bug, a pincer-like implement with a rope threaded through the handles in such a way that tension of the rope increased the force of the grip. Thus, the more the animal struggled, the more securely it was held. The horns were now cut with long-handled shears right back close to the head, and the blood spurted out. If the bleeding was bad, the wound was dressed with some medicament or cauterized with an instrument taken out of the branding fire. Then the gate was kicked open, and the hornless beast staggered into the empty corral, seeking something on which to vent its rage. That was why I had been ordered off the rail. I could not stomach much of this sort of spectacle, and went up to the ranch house to talk to Miss Cromie. She explained that the horns must be cut back in this way, partly because otherwise the animals would injure each other on the range, and partly because the cattle are required to be hornless when they are shipped for slaughter. They are driven into the train wagons by way of a narrow chute, and if they jostle each other, the meat is bruised, and so not marketable. I asked if the horns could not be stunted at birth, and was reminded that the calves are born on the range, and can only be dealt with at roundup. Before fixing a date for dehorning and castrating his beast, the rancher consults an almanac, choosing a day when the auspices are favorable. The blood is said to be in certain quarters of the body according to the sign of the zodiac, which is in the ascendants, and no rancher in his senses would dehorn on a day when the blood is in the head. If he did, and as rarely happens, one of the calves bled to death, everyone would say, "Well, what did he expect?" By the time I returned to the corrals, the men were dealing with the younger cattle, and their skill in handling them was a joy to watch. A bunch of calves was herded into the top corral, and all gates were closed. When all was ready, the big gate was opened, and Henry trotted in and circled the corral. I did not even see him throw the lasso among the frightened animals, but the next moment he was trotting out with a steer in tow. The gate was shut behind him, and as he went by, Alfie lassoed the steer by the back leg, while someone else did the same by the fore leg. The steer was thrown, and every available man held on to the ropes, which were wrapped round the strongest logs in the fence. Having often tried to hold a dog while I cut its toe-nails, I could have some idea of the strength needed to hold a struggling calf. Some of the calves had to be dehorned, castrated, branded with hot irons, and ear-marked, a notch cut out of the ear, all in one operation. The smell of the smoke sizzling upwards, and the sickening crunch of the shears turned my stomach. When they were released, the animals appeared dazed and stood bellowing, with the blood dripping in pools around them. It is very exhausting work for the cowboys, and they do not enjoy inflicting pain on the beast. But a hungry world cries out for meat, and this is the usual way of dealing with cattle in the mass. On our way back from the round-up, Ralph stopped to loosen the girth of his horse, and I took time to look behind us. Below were the tiny, distant ranch buildings, the canyon, the rooftop of the ranch house. All around were the pastures and the mountain ranges, and miles away were 3 cowboys galloping in line, tiny specks, as they drove some animals up to a pasture. Then they turned and came down the mountain like the wind. Ralph said that the last man had to shut the gate, and they were racing each other down to it. That picture, like a scene in silhouette in a miniature theater, is vivid in my memory. When we rode down to Big Bar Ranch, we took the right-hand path at the fork of the roads. I wanted to know what lay along the other road. So one Sunday afternoon, at the end of April, I borrowed Marjorie's mare, Priscilla, and went exploring. How often, in the silence and beauty of these surroundings, I returned thanks that I was a part of them. I could not understand why my city friends, when writing to me, commiserated with me on the privations of the life I was leading. Sunday afternoon recreation in the city would involve the frustrations of waiting for buses and jostling among crowds, shut in by the witness of man's power. Here in the wilderness, I was in the midst of a natural beauty, which provided a perpetual monument to the power of God. I rode for a way through green bowers, and then came to a blind curve, flanked on the inside by rocky walls, and on the outer side by a precipitous drop to the creek, 300 feet or so below. I wondered how the rancher managed to drive his truck along it without disaster. There were only a few inches to spare outside the wheel tracks. Priscilla objected to walking close to the overhanging wall of rock, and would insist on following the outside edge of the curve, and my heart was in my mouth. However, at last we had negotiated it, and found ourselves out on the range, with meadow larks whistling over rolling grassland, and with distant glimpses of the Fraser River flowing between rock-bound walls. I met the rancher trying to bring up a cow with a newborn calf. She was on my side of the fence, so I offered my help. He was sure I could not manage it, as the cow was wild, but I could not let such a chance go by. So, with the expert help of Priscilla, I brought them up. The cow gave us a wicked look now and again, but she was not aggressive. After a pleasant meal with the rancher and his wife, I set off for home. On the way back, at one point, hearing a hiss, I looked behind. A cream and brown snake, a good yard long, was just gliding over the edge. If it had crossed Priscilla's path, and she had shied, I should have hurtled down to the cottonwood trees below. We had another dance before Easter. It was a delightful party. Everyone behaved beautifully, and Jack was perfectly sober. I had told the children that the previous dance had been spoilt for me, so after this one they asked anxiously if I had enjoyed it. I said, yes, very much, and asked them to thank everyone for me. By now the progress the children were making in the formal subjects had become very noticeable. The pupils in grades 1, 2, and 3 were all near the end of their arithmetic syllabus for the year. Viva, in grade 3, had already gone on to the grade 4 book. Douglas still had difficulty with reading, but he had worked with determination at handwriting and was now producing a written composition every week. Arthur had resolved his difficulties with number. I had come to the conclusion that his backwardness had been due to the fact that he had been too shy to ask for help when he did not understand. Pete was attending regularly, at last, and making progress. Fred, in grade 5, was keeping level with Edgar for the first time. Fred had a stutter in his speech, and I had thought that perhaps he had been pressed to read too early. But when I heard the story of an incident that had happened to him in childhood, I revised my opinion. When he was about 5 years old, he had been playing on the mountain side, behind his home, one sunny spring day. He was cutting out paper horses and happily occupied, when suddenly a shadow passed across the sun. The chickens fled squawking up the ditch, and a swooping eagle seized Fred and tried to carry him off. One claw grabbed his shoulder, and the other tore at his mouth. Fred screamed in terror, and the yellow hound came flying out of the house, but could not get under the fence. An elder brother had heard the scream, however, and he came running. When he saw what was happening, he grabbed the bench axe, cleared the fence at a bound, and struck off the eagle's head with the axe. The bird's wings measured 10 feet across. They carried the little boy into the house, but he was ill for a long time afterwards. I supposed that the impediment in his speech might be a legacy from the shock which he had suffered then. Floyd and Dick were making pleasing improvement. It was obvious from Floyd's gay and vigorous drawings that he had a lively brain. He romped away with number work, but his progress in reading was still slow. Dick could now read and write and produce short compositions without help. The nature diary, by this time, contained entries with little tales of adventures, which would turn an English boy green with envy. On Saturday, I went with Joe to Stinking Lake, hunting horses. We were riding along when we saw a wolf. He ran away, and we chased him. We did not have a gun. Arthur. A big black bear was going up the hill, and we told Bingo, and he barked at the bear. We sent Bingo after the bear, and he caught up to it and bit it. The bear got angry and slapped Bingo and knocked him down. Bingo was tired. The bear was going up the hill. He climbed the bluffs, and we lost sight of him. Minnie. One night we heard something scratching on a broom, and Dad thought it was a cat. We had forgotten to shut the door, and a porcupine came in and was going to quill Marjorie and Roy. It climbed up the wall, and Jean got the gun, and Dad shot it. Ralph. Yesterday, Bill trapped a bobcat. It came and killed 8 of his chickens in the night. Bill found 2 chickens lying in a corner, too scared to get up. He put them in an old box outside the house. That night Bill set 2 traps for the cat. He trapped it by the left hind foot. The cat dragged the trap over to the fence and got caught on the rail. Bill went out in the morning, and the cat started to spit at him, so he fetched the gun and shot her. Edgar. The finest medium of education is experience, and the experience of my pupils with regard to the civilization of which they were supposed to be a part was extremely limited. I was required to fill them with facts about continents and oceans when they could visualize no geographical conditions other than those of their own valley, to train them to keep such rules of health as that of a daily bath when their only source of water supply was under ice a foot deep, to encourage interest in the achievements of the United Nations when they did not know how to read a newspaper intelligently. From the point of view of modern civilized life, these children started with a severe handicap. They never heard, even mentioned, many topics which are a commonplace among educated people. The fact that they had fallen so far below the standards of a city child indicated not lack of intelligence, but lack of experience. It became my aim to do something to improve this situation, although my own opinion was that they were amply compensated by their experience of wilderness life for what they missed of civilization, having first-hand knowledge of things that the city child had to study from books. Yet, since the educational system required them to know more about citizenship, I proposed to introduce them to its manifestations, in fact and in deed, and not merely by word. I had been working for months on a plan to take the whole group of children to the city of Kamloops to see what high school education really meant. This had involved persistent correspondence, first with the principal of the Kamloops High School, who was surprised but cooperative, then with the Department of Education, and with my own school board. The department gave a cautious consent to the scheme, provided the school board acquiesced. So I wrote to the secretary of the school board and said that I had the consent of the department, and would they agree. They needed reassurance that my project would involve them in no financial outlay, and a written waiver from the parents to the effect that they would not hold the school board responsible for compensation in the event of an accident, and then authorized me to carry on. It now remained for me to find the necessary funds. I wrote to the IODE, who immediately voted us $50, and to the Parent Teachers Association of the Queen Mary's School in Vancouver, who sent us $25. There were all sorts of difficulties. If we went by bus, we should have to travel in the middle of the night. There was no train nearer than Ashcroft, so we must go by taxi. I wrote to the taxi driver at Clinton, who was so much inspired by the idea that he offered the services of himself and his wife without charge, a gesture that was worth $25 to us. I was prepared to foot the rest of the bill myself. The biggest problem, however, was the question of accommodation for the children in Kamloops. I wondered if the high school pupils would be responsible for this, and in time I received a brief note from the principal saying that the girls of the High Y Club, the high school branch of the YWCA, would look after them. I thought perhaps they were making one of the school rooms into a dormitory for them, or putting them up in a hostel. I had asked each of the children to bring $2 towards the cost of the trip. They could not afford more, in view of the necessity to buy clothing and to reserve a little for pocket money. I was very much disappointed when Henry declined to allow his children to come with us. I thought perhaps he could not raise the money, and I went to see him. I had looked forward to hearing Floyd's comments on the wonders of civilization. He was adamant none of them could go. I pointed out that Marjorie was the senior pupil and should represent the school, and at last he relented to the extent of permitting her to come. It was not until after we returned, and they were all eager to write compositions about what they had done, that I learnt from Ralph's composition his father's reason for keeping him at home. While the children of Big Bar Creek School went to Kamloops, he wrote, I had to stay at home and hoe potatoes and mind young calves. On Wednesday, May 11th, 1949, 9 children gathered at the Mountain House at Jesmond with smiling faces, tightly clutched grips, and I am sure fast-beating hearts. The 2 taxis were there waiting, and we had a 7-hour journey ahead of us. First, for miles and miles through forest on a switchback road, then on the high road, alongside canyons, over bridges, across railways, bordering lakes, till at last we saw the roofs of Kamloops below us. About 7 p.m., we were parked outside the high school, hot, exhausted, and hungry. A high school student who had been watching for us came over and took us to her home, where we sat in a cool sitting room while she made numerous telephone calls. Then her schoolmates began to arrive to claim their protégés. They were entertaining the children in their own homes, and whisked them away to wash and change and eat a huge supper. That first evening, in spite of the effects of the journey, they were ready to be taken out to see the sights of the town: stores, neon lights, roller skating, ice cream parlors, street cars. The next morning we met at the school, and I heard of their thrill at having not only beds, but bedrooms to themselves. Some of them had thought that the toilet was a foot bath, and had had fun splashing in it. They had wondered also to see hot water run out of a tap, while I talked to the principal of the high school to plan some activities. The children were taken round and introduced to the classes by their hostesses. Little Dick was the darling of the girls in grade 12. We spent the first half hour at a music class, the music master explaining to us the different wind instruments of the orchestra and letting his pupils demonstrate their use. We then went on to the local broadcast station to see what goes to the making of a radio program. This developed into a long, informal interview, which was recorded and broadcast during the lunch hour. Some of the people in Big Bar Creek heard it. Douglas, of course, created a diversion by collapsing backwards through swinging on the back legs of his chair, but the commentator worked it all in naturally. Every child spoke a few words on the air. The commentator asked them what they had for breakfast, and they described their repast. And then he said, "Well, do you have that in Big Bar Creek too?" "No," said Dick. "What do you have there?" asked the interviewer. Nobody could think what they had. Then Michael said in a loud voice, "Mush, porridge," and everyone laughed. After lunch, the principal himself took the children round the school, and then we attended an instructional film in the art room. We were invited to visit the office of the Kamloops Sentinel and saw some of the processes that go to the making of a newspaper. Next we went to the museum, where the history master from the school explained the exhibits, and the children saw historic Indian relics and stuffed animals and birds. These were displayed so naturally that at first they thought they were alive. After school, there was a baseball practice in the park, so I took the children down there and left them enjoying the green grass and watching the play. That night, their hostesses took them all to the movies. The next day, Friday, was a school holiday on account of the May Day celebrations. It was quite by accident that I had chosen this week. We watched the parade in the morning. All the local schools were represented, and there were decorated cars and floats and children's bicycles and perambulators. We followed the parade to the park and joined the crowds watching the maypole dancing. There were 5 maypoles, and Japanese ceremonial dancing and gypsy dancing, and a fine display of vaulting by the boys of the Indian residential school. The Big Bar Creek children had all been given free tickets for pop and ice cream, and Michael enjoyed himself very much, collecting empty bottles for the ladies at the booths and earning hot dogs. They took part in the sports, and they watched the swimming and diving in the river. They were amazed by the number of children. Never had they seen so many in one place. That night there was a party for the children in one of the homes. It was a wonderful party, beginning with croquet on the lawn and developing into an informal softball match in the field, followed by musical games indoors and a lovely supper with sandwiches and iced cake and fruit drinks and ice cream. Then Fred and Pete escorted Marjorie and Minnie to the teenage dance in town. Fred told me afterwards that they did not dance because it was a different sort of dancing, but everyone talked to them and they sure had lovely music. On Saturday morning, 3 of the teaching staff came with their cars to take us out to the airport. This was not a passenger airport, but had been taken over from the military and was being used as a base from which the planes went out to spray swamps with DDT to kill the mosquito larvae. Here we saw 6 or 7 planes on the ground. Most of them were one-engined. One pilot was loading up with DDT. He explained his instruments to the children, and they watched him take off. After this, we were driven on to a village called Tranquil and shown over the lovely grounds of the TB sanatorium. It did not occur to me to explain to the children that the people reclining on the lawns were patients, but I found from Edgar's composition afterwards that he was worried because there were signs saying, "Keep off the grass," but people were sitting all over the grass. After dinner, we gathered at the Canadian Pacific Railway Station in Kamloops to wait for the train to Ashcroft, where the taxis would meet us. I had arranged this so that the children would have some idea of what traveling on a train was like. All the hostesses and some of their parents came to see us off, loaded with gifts of cookies and cakes and candy for the children. The lady in whose house Dick had stayed sent me a note to say that it was a long time since she had met such a well-behaved and nicely mannered child, and hoping that if ever he could come to Kamloops again, he would stay with them. As the train pulled out, there was much waving of hands and repeated calls of "come again next year." We had a pleasant drive to Clinton, where another surprise awaited us. The Parent-Teacher Association of the Clinton School had prepared a lovely supper for us. Some of the children had eaten so much on the journey that they could not do full justice to it, but it was a delicious meal. On Monday morning, the children demanded that they should write compositions all day, since they could never write all they had to say in 1 hour. In the afternoon, they had another idea. They had been fascinated by the swimming and diving at Kamloops, and when we were discussing this, Pete said, "We could make a swimming pool in the creek." My instinct was to say, "Oh no, indeed you couldn't," but I had come to have such respect for their capabilities that I merely said, "Could you?" And we went down to the creek to select a suitable spot. We found a shallower part in between 2 sets of little rapids, and Pete, Fred, Douglas, and Michael, working like beavers, dammed this to make a delightful pool under the canopy of the cottonwood trees. Fred cut down a well-branched tree to fall across the water, and into the branches they wove old planks which were lying around, and stumps from the wood pile, and pliable branches of willow. They must have learnt how to do it when making fish dams with their parents. The pool was not deep enough for real swimming, but at least they could learn to be at ease with the water. Now that spring had come, I was not so much cut off from human society. I could walk up the valley on Sunday afternoons and visit the children's homes, or call for a chat with Miss Dinger. I had to keep to the road because the mountainside was patched with little cushions of prickly pear cactus, full of the most penetrating needles. If you accidentally brushed against the cushions, a bunch of them would break off and hang from your foot. The needles were barbed and painful to extract. The cactus flowers, however, were very pretty, waxy, primrose-colored blooms that looked like miniature water lilies, and I would put on thick leather gloves and go out to gather a bowlful to decorate my kitchen table. I had been disappointed to find that one could not go out in sandals because of the cactus, nor could the children play football. On Friday afternoons, when the children had gone home, I used to amuse myself down by the creek. I found it as fascinating as did the children themselves. I would hunt grasshoppers under the stones on my way down, or cut a juicy bit off my joint of meat if it was not yet cooked. And with an improvised rod, I would fish for my supper or my next morning's breakfast. At first I could catch the trout, but I could not keep them. I did not know how to kill a cold-blooded fish, and I would put them on the bank far enough from the water. But no sooner was my back turned than the fish would give a spasmodic series of leaps and plop back into the creek. Douglas told me how to knock them sharply on a branch. The fish I caught were rainbow trout, very small, but very good to eat. I did not see one more than 11 inches long taken out of the creek, and mine were generally 8 or 9 inches. There were now more exciting incidents to report in the nature diary. Last night we were eating supper, and we heard a coyote holler. We ran out to the door, and Ralph got the gun. Jack shot towards the hill. Patsy had a fight with the coyote, and the coyote was choking Floyd. I was riding down the road, and I saw a red deer. I stopped and hollered to him. He ran down to Bill's fence, and that was the last of him. Douglas. Yesterday, Dad and Alfie went to brand cattle, and on the way back, Alfie caught a magpie for me. Early this morning, I caught some grasshoppers for him. I am going to keep him and catch some crows and take him and sell him for $2. Once I read a story of a tame crow, and so I am going to tame a magpie. We have got him in a box. He makes a noise when you go up to him. Ralph. I went down to the spring looking for horses, with Bowser trotting way ahead of me. Bill said his dog had chased the horses up the road. There was nothing to do but go back. I passed the strawberry patch. I went up towards the flat. I was walking on one side of the gulch when Bowser's hair stood up on his back, and he growled. On the other side of the gulch, I saw a big brown bear looking at me. Sitting down, he was as high as I am. His black nose was pointed at me, and he had great paws that could smash me flat. Bowser wanted to chase the bear. He ran after it and bit its heels. The bear slapped at Bowser, but it missed. It ran down across the creek. and up the other side of the flat. I got Buck, who was snorting at the foot of the flat, and I rode home to tell Mom. Michael. The last month of this first year went very quickly. There was much activity in the valley now. The cowboys brought streams of horses down the mountain sides, and they trotted past the school with manes dancing and feathered tails flowing. Blacks and sorrels and grays and roans, pintos and palominos and buckskins, mares followed by their lovely long-legged colts, and gleaming stallions, tossing and snorting as they went. After school, I would go down to Henry's place to watch the boys trying them out. Some of them might have been running the range for 2 or 3 seasons without getting caught, and would be really wild. One evening when I arrived, young Alfie had just taken a toss and was hesitating about approaching a handsome palomino. He invited Jack to take the first chance. Jack approached the palomino gradually, calming it when it backed nervously, and with a quick, smooth movement he threw the rope round its neck, and had leapt from the ground straight on to its back. He gentled it for a while, and then ventured out of the corral and up the road, young Alfie leading the way on a saddle horse. On the last day, the children asked, "Are you quitting at the end of the term?" The teacher at this school did not usually last more than a year. I answered, "Maybe I'm waiting to see if anyone says we would like you to come back next year." "Heck, we don't care," said the boys, but many spoke up quietly from the back of the room. "We should like you to come back, Miss Taylor." I had every hope of coming back. There was much to be done, and I wanted to enjoy again the succession of the seasons in this lovely valley. My little garden was now prospering. In the fall, when we had finally uprooted the tumbleweed, I had found that a good depth of earth was banked around the cabin, and had naturally assumed that this was for the purpose of making a garden. Actually, it was intended as a protection against the cold. I had carried a few pailfuls of dried manure over from the barn and dug it well in. The bed in front of the house was now gay with nasturtiums, with asters and snapdragons to follow, and on the sunny bank behind were rows of beetroot and potatoes, and 5 ripening marrows. Ralph had said to me one day, "You're the first teacher in this valley who has had any ideas." This was a very gratifying remark, especially from Ralph, but I was surprised to find that his commendation was for my efforts at the gardening. If someone could be persuaded to attend to the watering, I could look forward to enjoying the fruits of my labor when I returned to the valley in September. Chapter 8. Beside the Still Waters. I spent the summer vacation in Vancouver, and in spite of the delights of beach picnics and mountain rambles, I looked forward every day to my return to the valley. This time I found my own way there, and when the taxi deposited me at the cabin, there was no riot of tumbleweed round the door, but a flame of color behind the wire netting. Inside, alas, the same old enemies had been at work. The pack rats had left their characteristic odor behind them, and the mice had made nest and obviously raised families among my sweaters in the chest of drawers. I had to empty all the drawers and scrub them with disinfectant before I could begin to unpack my bags, and it was only after repeated washings that the clothing lost the smell of mice. I had several meals from my potatoes and beetroots, and I made jam from the green tomatoes and the marrows, and enjoyed the color round my door. But 6 days after the beginning of the term, we had the first frost, and the gardens were blasted in a night. In school, we spent the first day waging war on the rats, scrubbing to get rid of the smell. Nothing had been done to the premises in the way of cleaning or decorating, and the cupboard still had no back wall. Our efforts were no more than an inconvenience to the pack rats. They had plenty of refuge under the floorboards and between the logs in the roof. I had brought back with me some pieces of embroidery, and they all, even the boys, elected to embroider a gay square to make a nursery cot cover for the hospital. We kept the squares in a cardboard box on my desk. One morning I noticed that the lid was askew on the box, but it was not until the afternoon, when we came to the lesson, that we found the pieces missing. I rounded on Michael, who was always up to tricks, but he said indignantly that he had not touched the box. Then Douglas noticed a trail of dirt leading from my desk, and followed it to the wall blackboard. He prized the blackboard away from the logs, and retrieved piece after piece of embroidery, now riddled with gnawed holes, from the chinks. Some of the pieces were right up in the roof. Under the blackboard there was a loose plank in the floor. I found that the space beneath it was the repository for an unexpected assortment of objects. I never knew how many had been carried by the rats, and how many had been cached by Douglas, who sat near it. Michael had his cache on the other side of the room. The children had a trick of reserving for themselves the best pair of scissors, for instance, and hiding it in some secret place. Then, of course, they were liable to forget all about it, and if they were absent from school, the rest of us had to waste time hunting for it. Their big brothers did the same sort of thing with the tools on the ranch, to the exasperation of the ranchers. There was now an exciting new feature of valley life. The Canadian federal government at Ottawa had begun to concern itself very commendably with the cultural amenities of the rural areas, and the previous June I had received a visit from a gentleman who gave me a long harangue about the role of the school as a community center. I pointed out to him that I had been brought up in an educational tradition where for nearly a century the rural school, being generally a church school, had been the center of community life. He then told me that the national Film Board of Canada would make available to the people of the district a number of movie films, which would make a circuit of rural schools. The complete equipment necessary for the projection of the films, at the cost of about $3,000, would be brought down the valley on the stage truck for the performance once every 5 weeks. The only cost to the inhabitants would be that of freight charges in sending the equipment on to the next school. It would be necessary also for the locality to provide the projectionist for the occasion. This duty was undertaken by the school trustee. The films shown at our first performance were documentaries of a high standard. The first one showed the herding of the sheep from Kamloops, which are brought to our ranges to pasture in the spring, and taken back again in the autumn, an experience which the children could thoroughly appreciate. This was followed in the same program by a film showing the herding of reindeer by the Lapps, and it made me feel that the Lapps were first cousins to these people. I felt that this traveling cinema was a very far-sighted project, giving these isolated children wider horizons in their conception of life. The school board had also provided the school with a battery radio set with gramophone attachment. Unfortunately, radio reception was very bad in the valley during the day, and we could only get programs relayed from Kamloops, but the gramophone would be useful both in school and at dances. I thought to myself, now I shall be able to teach musical appreciation. When I was ordering gramophone records, I asked the children for suggestions. They said merely, "We don't want old women who screech." I had thought of buying sea shanties and folk songs, but they demanded cowboy songs, and it occurred to me that these were, of course, their own folk songs. In their opinion, the greatest musical genius was Stephen Foster, who wrote "Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair," and one of Jack's arguments in support of drinking whiskey was that Stephen Foster had composed his best work when he was drunk. I bought a selection of cowboy records, and the children would put them on in the afternoons when they were doing recreative work, so that my recollections of the autumn afternoons is of the children modeling their little animals to the strains of Tumbling Tumbleweed or the Everlasting Hills of Oklahoma. I also bought 2 Bible story records in which the story was narrated with accompanying effects. Their favorite was the story of David and Goliath. They waited eagerly for the ping of the slingshot, and as it registered, I could see every boy projecting himself into the role of David. The first news I had heard when I came back after the summer vacation was that Minnie Dunn, Michael's mother, had been taken away to hospital with undulant fever. This left the Higginbottom family without a woman to look after them. The boys would have to prepare their own lunch boxes before leaving for school each morning, and Alfie would have to cope as best he could with the inside as well as the outside chores. The following Sunday afternoon, I went visiting. This was the time of year when I could enjoy the long walk up the mountain road to Miss Dinger's. She was my nearest white neighbor, and lived with her husband and her mother in a charming Bavarian-style house about 4 miles up the valley. The children told me one day that Mr. Dinger was a Mormon, and for a time I supposed that he practiced polygamy, as they said he had 2 womenfolk. His ranch was always beautifully neat, and his animals well cared for, and I liked to talk to Miss Dinger, because she seemed to be really fond of the Indian children. On my way back, I left the road and went up the trail to Alfie's ranch to inquire about Minnie Dunn. The house was a 1-storied log cabin with several rooms, and with a veranda overlooking the valley. In this family, besides Alfie and Minnie, and the 5 boys attending school, there were 2 ewes, Cecil, Alfie's son, and Norman, Minnie's son, by a different father from Michael's. A little girl of Alfie's, named Tootsie, who was 7 years old, and a 3-year-old named Ellen. So with all these mouths to feed, Alfie needed to be a good hunter, not only to provide them with deer meat to eat, but in order to obtain commissions as guide to the American and Canadian hunters who came to stay at Jesmond. This was a well-paid job, which gave the native people the wherewithal to buy store clothing and groceries. Alfie was not only a good hunter, but also a competent household manager. He showed me with pride the root cellar, full of preserved peaches, from the Okanagan Valley, where Pete had been working during the summer, and other fruit and jars of salted salmon and dry fish, all prepared by himself. The children would certainly not go hungry. Alfie and Annie Grinder, Henry's wife, were step-brother and sister, and Alfie claimed that his father had been English. Neither he nor Annie had had any education, but Alfie could write and reckon, and he had 1 or 2 party tricks. He loved to stand on his head on a chair. Annie had told me her story one day. She said when she was about 12 years old, the sisters fetched her away from her home because her father was having sexual relations with her elder sister. Her mother's people allowed her to be taken away, as they understood she was being sent to school in Vancouver. Annie did indeed travel to Vancouver, and began to work in a boys' residential school there. During the first week she received lessons in the afternoon from one of the fathers. Then the lessons lapsed, but she remained to help with the domestic chores. Well housed and well fed, and safe from the dangers which her home life might have presented. After a number of years, her relatives demanded her return, and with the accumulated wages of $25, she came back and married Henry. Henry, a tall, lean, handsome Indian type, always avoided my society. Particularly he seemed to resent my camera. I never got to know him properly, though after a time he would wave to me from the road above as he drove the hay wagon or the sled on his way to Grandma Grinder's. His mother lived up near Miss Dinger's. She was of German stock, and was very hospitable. She kept a barrel of homemade sauerkraut in her kitchen. Later on in the term, I asked the boys how Alfie was getting on with the housekeeping, and they told me that Anna was looking after them. I rejoiced to hear this, because Anna was Alfie's wife, and I had felt for some time that the boys were missing their mother's influence. I had never met Anna, and only knew that she had left the home a year or two previously after a disastrous quarrel. So I went again on a Sunday afternoon to call on the Higginbottoms. When I arrived, I found so many people about that it took me some time to sort things out. Minnie was home from the hospital with her new baby. She was in bed, and I did not see her, but the pretty cot could be seen through the half-open door. In the main room, Anna sat at a treadle sewing machine, stitching madly, surrounded by piles of jeans and shirts and underpants. Her own new baby was in a pram in the room, and she got up and attended to it from time to time, or went into the bedroom in response to Minnie's call, or to soothe Minnie's baby. The boy drifted in and out to cross-question me about the topics that happened to be occupying their attention. Little Ellen, whom I now saw for the first time, came running into the room, and resting her elbows confidingly on my lap, she looked up into my face and said, "Hello, Grandma." Everybody laughed, and when I had rallied, I searched in my pockets for the bag of sweeties which every self-respecting grandma carries around with her. On my walk home, I pondered on the situation in which an expelled wife returned to her husband's home to minister to her successor. I decided she must be either a saint or a simpleton, but I learnt later that Alfie was paying her $60 a month to be his housekeeper. Old Johnny and Melanie lived at the other end of the valley. Melanie, fat, squat, and Indian-looking, had a warm and welcoming nature, and I never felt a stranger in her house. Perhaps this was because she treated me as an equal, whereas the others had symptoms of an inferiority complex. Melanie's home was gay with potted geraniums, and though the beds in the four corners of the big room were tumbled and gray-looking, the family laundry was strung across the room, crisply starched and ironed. Melanie, too, had the shelves in her root cellar loaded, and her tea biscuits, great big scones, hot from the oven, and dripping with butter, positively melted in the mouth. Her sons all had a healthy respect for her anger, even little Johnny, whose ruin was whiskey. Little Johnny had been to England as a soldier in the recent war. He for a time was stationed in the camp at Aldershot. I said to him, "You must have been terribly homesick," and he told me that when he was lonesome, he used to go into the fields by himself and snare the little rabbits to play with. Twice a year, great flocks of sheep were driven through the valley on their way to or from green pastures on the other side of the Fraser River. They came from Kamloops, and the sheep herders must have had a difficult job protecting their herds from the depredations of covetous humans as well as of wild beasts. After the sheep had passed through the valley, most families were richer by a lamb or two which they had rescued from the coyotes. The herds came through the forest, along the top of the range, behind the school, and struck the road further down the valley, so that I had never seen them. I had been mystified the previous September, when the children had said to me, "Would you like a lamb?" "A lamb," I said. "Yes, I should love to have one. Is somebody going to give me a lamb?" And they had replied, "We saw the herders last night, and we said, 'Can the teacher have a lamb?' And they said, 'Sure, go ahead. We're not looking.'" "But do the lambs belong to the herders?" I had asked. "I don't want you to take other people's property." And they had replied, "We can get you one." This year, when Minnie and Arthur, whose home was nearer the river, came to school with the news that the sheep would cross by the ferry that day, I decided to go down and watch them. We closed school early that afternoon, and I went home with the children who lived down the valley. It was too far for us to go all the way to the river, so we stayed in an alfalfa field, green and cool in the shadow of the mountain. By 4 o'clock, most of the children had gone home, and I was about to leave when Melanie called from the house and pointed down the valley. A cloud of dust was rising into the golden sunlight, so we knew the sheep were on the way. Minnie and Arthur and I walked down to meet them. We heard the bleating of thousands of sheep and lambs, and then, turning a bend, saw the narrow road between the mountain sides, heaving with white, woolly backs. The herder, leaning on his staff like an Old Testament shepherd, was naked to the waist, for although it was the beginning of October, the weather during the day was very hot. We climbed the slopes a little way to see the extent of the flock. There were 2,500 animals, we were told. Then we hurried back to see that the flock did not enter the alfalfa field or break through the fence into the orchard. Where the valley widened, we watched the sheep spread out and go cascading past like an endless torrent, raising a dust as thick as a London fog, crushing the sage till the scent of it drenched the air. Arthur had left the barn door invitingly open, but the herders were vigilant. One of them took up a point of vantage overlooking all the buildings, and after the last sheep had passed, he deliberately went into the barn and searched it. Following the sheep came the pack horses, carrying the herders' supplies. 3 patient little animals roped together, and one lordly mule, who walked where he chose, seizing a mouthful of hay where he could, and poking his nose into everything. He had a look in his eye like that of a naughty schoolboy. The packs were covered with natural, velvety, brown and white cowhide. They hung out from the sides of the animal and were subject to very heavy wear, being crushed against rocks and trees. I had supper at Melanie's, and on my way home I overtook the flock again. The herders had camped, and I could hear the bleating all around, but I could not distinguish sheep from sage bushes on the mountain side. In the gathering dark, the rising moon was a silver sickle. I did not linger on the way, as I knew there would be wild beasts circling the flock. One Saturday morning in October, when it seemed that to ride over Big Bar Mountain must be the most delightful thing in the world to do, I borrowed Marjorie's mare to ride the 14 miles to the OK Ranch. I had received a very welcome invitation from Miss Marriott to ride over some time and spend a weekend with them, and as I had no means of contacting them, I had to hope this would be a convenient occasion. I could not have chosen a more perfect October day. The golden cottonwood trees, and here and there a scarlet maple, were brilliant against the dark green of the pine-forested mountain walls. Squirrels scolded me from the lower branches of the pine trees. Chipmunks scampered along the fence rails, and by the roadside, at the top of the mountain, I saw an ermine, a pure white weasel, with a black tip to his tail. Annie had lent me her saddle, but it was too wide for me, and the chafing against my thighs punished me. The horse was very slow. She simply would not lope, and trotting was really painful, so it took us a long time. After a very steep climb, we came to a most inviting-looking trail leading to a gate into a recently mown hay field, and in the hope that this might prove a short cut, I turned Priscilla towards it. Gates in cowboy country have a high rail to prevent the horses from jumping over. The horse knew just what to do to enable me to open the gate without dismounting. She edged up to it broadside on until her nose was level with the catch, waited while I leaned over and unhooked it, backed and then walked through, then edged up again and pushed the gate into place. We found ourselves in a field surrounded by forest, and Priscilla suddenly woke up and loped across the soft green grass. We were just in time to see a young deer, a buck, go bounding into the woods on the far side of the field. When we came to another gate, I felt we were on the wrong trail, and we went back and followed the road again. I went on and on, with not the slightest hope of meeting anyone from whom I could ask the way. We passed one or two uninhabited cabins and an old building that had been a school. I looked through the broken windows and saw old school books lying on the floor. At last, just when I was beginning to feel that I could not endure the torture of the chafing saddle a moment longer, the horse surprised me by leaving the road deliberately, and we were soon coming out from the trees to see the ranch buildings spread out below us. I dismounted and flexed my bowed legs a while before tying Priscilla to the gate post. Then I went into the ranch house. There appeared to be no one about. Miss Marriott had said that in this event I was to go inside and help myself. and as it was now mid-afternoon, and I had eaten nothing since an early breakfast, I followed her instructions. When Mr. Marriott came in from his work on the ranch, he was surprised to see me. His wife had gone over to Big Bar Lake, where she had a guest ranch for summer visitors, to stay for the weekend and close the place up, and Ronald, their son, was in Ashcroft. Mr. Marriott had lived in the district for many years and could tell me interesting stories of pioneering days in the valley, when the grandparents of my present pupils had been young and prosperous and open-hearted. A neighboring rancher and his wife came to supper, and we spent a very pleasant evening. The next day I went out to explore by myself. The creek up here was wide and placid, and Herefordshire cows dotted the fields. A dog came running down the slope and across my path, a sort of Alsatian it seemed, with its tail well tucked between its legs. I asked Mr. Marriott later whose dog it might be, and he told me it would be no dog, but a pestilential coyote, and that I should have taken a gun with me. I left early that afternoon, in anticipation of an uncomfortable ride, and I was very sore by the time I reached home. I had an idea that this visit of mine would not pass without comment from the children. The catechism began in quite a casual way. "Heard you were up at the OK Ranch on Saturday," said Douglas. "Did you?" I asked. "Yes." "Were you?" asked Ralph. "I was." "Did they ask you to go?" "Miss Marriott wrote and invited me to ride over some weekend." "Was Miss Marriott at home?" asked Michael. "No, she was at Big Bar Lake." "Was Ron at home?" "No." "Where was he?" asked Floyd. "I don't know." "Was Harry at home?" "Mr. Marriott." "Yes." "Anybody else there?" asked Douglas. "Yes, we had visitors for supper." "Did they stay the night?" "No." "Did you stay the night?" "Yes." There was a pause. I could, of course, have terminated the conversation long before this, but I felt that my answers might be important to these children. If I snubbed them, they would cease to cross-question me, but the problem would not be solved in their own minds. At last came the final question. "Did you sleep upstairs?" "In a room to myself." "I certainly did," I replied, and I talked to them for a few minutes about the ways in which human beings can enjoy each other's society while respecting the rights of the husband or wife who may be absent. I told them that to get to know another person's mind and spirit was as wonderful as getting to know his body, and that the power to do this was a gift bestowed on human beings and not on animals, so that if we exercised only our physical qualities, we were not only wasting 2/3 of our personality, but were aligning ourselves entirely with the animal sphere. I said it was not always easy to respect other people's rights, but we could ask God for help. "Ask God," said Ralph, do you believe that trash?" And I told him that the only way to learn to believe in God was by practicing believing in Him, just as the only way to learn to ride a horse was by practicing riding it. It seemed to me that if I was not allowed to give these children instruction about Christianity, I was denying them what was their heritage by virtue of having been born in a country which was confessedly Christian. You can't change them. No, I thought, but they can change themselves if I can induce them to what to change. The trip to Kamloops had been a start. The girls, at any rate, would be inspired to make their homes clean and pretty, like the homes they had visited. How can people change if their environment remains the same? The pattern of life repeats itself indefinitely if there is no one to plant in the children the seed of a determination to live a better life than the life their parents had lived. The crudeness of my pupils' attitude to life expressed itself, sometimes unexpectedly. I asked where one of the fathers was on one occasion, and Floyd said, "I guess he's gone to get a woman." This was a parrot-like remark, obviously copied from the grown-ups, but it indicated the way of thinking. When I was wishing to introduce the older ones to verse-making, we examined the rhyme schemes and meter arrangements of various poems in their readers. Then, as an exercise in original verse-making, I took a nursery rhyme as a pattern on which we could base a parody. There was a little girl, and she had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good, and when she was bad, she was horrid. We discussed the rhyme and the beat, and then I said, "Now let's see what we can do." Michael began at once. There was a little girl, and her name was Pearl. Everybody laughed. Pearl was the name of a glamorous Indian girl who had been cooking for the Higginbottoms while Minnie Dunn was ill. There was a little girl, said Michael again, and her name was Pearl, and she asked Ed to go to bed with her. I took him straight across to my house. "Were you trying to be offensive?" I asked. "No," said Michael, with wide eyes. "Well, why did you say that?" "You asked us to make a rhyme like the other one," he replied. Boys should be taught by a man, of course, if they are to develop the qualities of manliness. But if of necessity a woman is put in charge of them, she is privileged in the opportunity she has of introducing refinements into their behavior, not such conventions as that of raising the hat, for instance, which derives from a medieval custom and would be quite out of place in a country where you need to wear not only a hat but also earmuffs to keep your head warm. But those courtesies which spring from a genuine consideration for the comfort of others before one's own, offering one's seat, carrying a parcel, standing aside to let others go through a door first. I talked to the children about courtesy and suggested that they should try to practice it. I sought the cooperation of our friends of the IODE in Vancouver, and they wrote the children a letter emphasizing the value of courtesy and pointing out that the good repute of a nation depends upon the little daily courtesies practiced by each individual. Then they offered a prize to the boy or girl who proved to be the most consistently courteous person throughout the coming school year. On receiving my report in June, they would send out a bicycle for the pupil who ranked first. For the next couple of weeks, I was overwhelmed with applications to chop my wood, and carry my water, and catch fish for my supper, until I pointed out that it was not that I wanted them to do my chores, but that I hoped they would, in all their association, at home, at school, among themselves, consider the other person before themselves. There were other problems that needed to be tackled. I had been in the habit of sending a child over to my house to fetch a book which I might need in school, but since the summer holidays I had begun to wonder if I was putting temptation in their way. I had begun to miss little things from my shelves, a packet of cherries, a tin of sweetened condensed milk, a handful of cigarettes. Douglas often smelt strongly of tobacco, and openly admitted smoking and chewing it, as well as taking snuff and drinking whiskey. Cecil came to call on me one Saturday afternoon, and asked me if I could lend Annie Grinder some flavoring for a cake. I had only got about a teaspoonful of vanilla flavoring left, the bottle having in some unaccountable way become almost empty, but I had some almond extract and a new bottle of lemon flavoring. Cecil paid me for the lemon flavoring and took it away with him. Half an hour later, he was back with Floyd. They wanted more, saying that the bottle had dropped and smashed on a rock. However, I could not spare any more. On Monday in school, I noticed a bulge under Floyd's shirt and asked what it was. He grinned and brought out the empty lemon flavoring bottle. I learnt that flavoring was often drunk as a substitute for whiskey. One morning, having without thinking sent Douglas over to my house to fetch a book, I said to him when he came back, "Have you anything in your pockets that you ought not to have, Douglas?" "No," said Douglas firmly. "Then you won't mind turning them out," I said. "Put the things on my desk." He turned out his trouser pockets to the linings, putting all his treasures on my desk. When he had finished, I said, "Is that all?" "Yes," said Douglas. "Well, what is that?" I asked, pointing to a bulge in his shirt pocket. Douglas took a step backwards and glared at me. "It's snaz," he said loudly. "What is snaz?" I inquired. "Snuff," said the children. "Well, put it on the desk," I said. "I won't," said Douglas. "You will," I said firmly. "I won't," repeated Douglas, clenching his hands and his teeth. I told the rest of the school to take the ball up on the hillside and have a recess. Then I said quietly to Douglas, "I asked you to put that tin on the desk." "I won't," said Douglas. "Then I shall have to take it from you," I said. I took him by the wrist, and Douglas fought fiercely. Then, just as I was about to take the box, he thrust it down the front of his trousers. I said, "Very well, Douglas, sit down." By this time, the windows were lined with peering faces. I rang the school bell, and the children began to come in. But as they came, Douglas went out, leaping through the open window. I assumed that he had given the tin to one of the others. He came in again through the door, and when they were all sitting in their places, I said, "Douglas has refused to obey me. If the children will not obey the teacher, there is no point in having a teacher. The school board spends a great deal of money to give you the chance of being educated. I shall have to write and tell them that in the case of Douglas, it is being wasted." Then I turned to Douglas and said, "Where is that tin of snuff?" "It's in the bush," said Douglas. "Go and get it," I said. He was outside for a few minutes, and then came back with the tin. "Put it on the desk," I said, and he did so. He had now obeyed my instructions, and the incident was over. But I sent Edgar home to ask their father to come and see me. He arrived when I was having my dinner, having whizzed down the mountain on Pete's old bicycle without brakes. At first he was uncooperative, saying that he had nothing to do with his children's behavior at school. But when the word snuff was mentioned, he sat up with interest. "So that was what happened to my new tin of snuff," he said. Then I realized why Douglas had defied me. He had been afraid that I should keep the tin of snuff, and his dad would give him a licking. I was afraid he would get his licking after all, because the tin was empty after it had been retrieved from the bush. It did not occur to me until afterwards that he had probably emptied the contents into his pocket after he jumped through the window. It seemed likely that there was some connection between the behavior of some of the children and their problems at home. Any instruction that I might give would have to be to the whole group, boys and girls, young and old. I consulted the Department of Education, and they sent me an excellent book, Growing Up, by Carl de Schweitz, which I read aloud as a successor to Paul Bunyan. It began with the arresting statement that each one of them had grown from a speck of life 10 times smaller than a pinpoint. As the book went on, they became absorbingly interested, so much so that they forgot the pictures they were drawing and hung on every word. They came out in turns to look at the diagrams, which showed the growth of the embryo and the position of the baby in the mother's body. I could only hope that this detailed explanation might be of some help to them. We had a holiday on Friday, November 11th, to celebrate Remembrance Day, and Miss Marriott sent Ron down with the truck to fetch me to the OK Ranch for the weekend. Miss Marriott and I went riding on the mountain the next morning. The weather was perfect, blue sky and green pines, and snow-tipped peaks surrounded us, like the pictures on the colored calendars. On Sunday afternoon, on horseback, I helped Mr. Marriott to drive some bulls to new pasture, and I felt quite a cowgirl. I appreciated this hospitality very much. If the ranchers in my own valley had sometimes made social overtures to me, life would have been less lonely. Christmas parcels began to arrive the first mail day in December, and I unpacked the cartons and piled up the presents in my house. This year, besides the presents from the IODE, there were gifts from the Parent-Teacher Association of the Queen Mary School in Vancouver and from the girls of the Kamloops High School. Not just one gift for each child, but a number of exciting-looking packages wrapped in red or green or blue tissue and tied with silver ribbons. Each package was labeled with the name of the child for whom it was intended, and the children would come over to my house on the thinnest of pretext and ask to see the parcels, which they would pick up and shake gently, trying to guess what they contained. Besides the actual gifts, there were huge boxes of clothing for distribution among all the families, and in the week before the party, I was up until the small hours every night, sorting out the dresses and coats and pajamas and underwear and labeling them for the recipients, making up packages of candies and nuts and oranges, and parceling little treasures for the younger children who did not yet attend school, as well as coping with the usual end-of-term duties, such as the setting and marking of examination papers and writing of reports. We had a big tree in the school this year, festooned with silver icicles and gleaming colored balls and other decorations sent by the IODE. Our entertainment this time was to be a homemade play called The Old Woman of Big Bar Creek. For a back cloth, we had painted a huge nursery rhyme shoe on the back of a wall map, and we hung this across the archway at the back of the room, leaving a space at each side for exits and entrances. When the play began, the children were asleep behind the shoe. Marjorie came in, appropriately attired, and announced, "I'm the old woman who lived in a shoe. I've got so many kids, I don't know what to do. I'll tell you about them and ask your advice, for I should like to know how to bring 'em up nice." She then recited a topical verse about each of the children. The one about Douglas began, "Douglas annoys me more than enough. He smokes my tobacco and snitches my snuff." As she came to the end of her verses, the children began to wake audibly, and then darted in and out from behind the shoe, pulling each other's hair and playing tricks and generally creating a riot. Suddenly, the window at the other end of the room burst open and Santa Claus climbed in. He strode down the room towards the stage, and then I stood up in the audience and called out, "Old woman, we see that you spoke very truly. Your children indeed are a trifle unruly, but how to improve them I have an idea, now that their friend Santa Claus is here." I then suggested in verse that the children should each recite a nursery rhyme to Santa Claus, and if he thought they were good enough, he would give them a present. They all did this in fine style, and then we gathered round Santa Claus and sang carols to celebrate the real spirit of Christmas. We had had an open autumn with no snow until December, but there had been plenty of frost. Before the frost came, the irrigation ditch had overflowed and flooded a level patch by the creek, and this was now ice several inches thick. On the mail day, immediately before the party, I received yet another case from the girls at Kamloops. This contained, joy of joys, pairs of ice skates, complete with boots, which the girls and their friends had outgrown. I knew the children would be thrilled with these, so I took them over to school at once, and the next morning I watched to see what happened. Edgar was the first pupil to arrive. He was responsible for lighting the school fire. I saw him go into the school. In less than a minute he was out again, hobbling across to the teacherage at full speed, with a skate on one foot. "Whose are the skates?" he asked. "They are for the children who get to school first," I replied. He flew back to school, and a few minutes later I heard him calling at the top of his voice, "Skates for the kids who get here first." There was a mad race between the children approaching the school from opposite directions. There were only 10 pairs of skates among the 12 children. As soon as they had strapped on the skates, they made for the patch of ice. They kept falling down, of course, but they were determined to get there. Some picked themselves up, and others continued crawling on all fours. When I had washed up my breakfast dishes, I followed them. Douglas could already take a couple of steps without crashing. Arthur did not try to take steps, but just coasted down the slope. Floyd spent most of his time on his hands and knees. I suggested that I should walk backwards in front of him while he held onto my hands, but as usual he scorned the offer. They were busy on the ice all the morning, learning to skate by trial and error, and making a very good job of it. From time to time, someone would come in to school to get warm and pass on his skates to another. Meanwhile, the girls were helping me to decorate the tree and make the room look really like Christmas. I had hoped that this year we should have a convincing Santa Claus. The IODE had sent a new costume and mask, so that we need not resort to the use of safety pins. And if only I could persuade one of the ranchers to act as Santa's stand-in, we could have thrilled the children. I needed someone with enough initiative to keep up an appropriate patter. There was a rancher living on an Indian reserve some miles away. He was himself part Indian, and so I assumed that he would have a special interest in my children. He had recently married a young girl who had been teaching in the district. I met them a few days before Christmas, and I said to his wife, "You will be able to give a party for the little Indian children." The rancher said at once, "Certainly not. You can't be familiar with those people." I was taken aback. I said, "But the children?" He repeated, "You can't be familiar with them." I did not manage to persuade any of the ranchers to play Santa Claus, so I had to fall back on the young fellows in the valley. In the end, I asked Jack, who played the part well, if a little bashfully, The children said afterwards, "Gee, Santa Claus was poor, slim." They say the horses are poor when they come down the mountain after the near starvation of the winter. After the carol singing, on the night of the party, everyone sat down and the huge boxes of presents were carried in. Santa had in his bag an offering for everyone in the room in the form of a packet of candies. Then the labeled gifts were handed out, armfuls of them, and for an hour or so there was no room to move for fear of treading on toy motor cars, or engines, or waddling ducks, or bouncing balls. Viva had 3 beautiful dolls, and even Marjorie had a doll, dressed in evening gown and cloak. There were surprises for me, too. Grandma Grinder had made me a lovely Christmas cake. The Kamloops girls sent a pair of bedroom slippers. The Queen Mary PTA gave me a book, and the ladies of the IODE sent a rosy wooden apple for the teacher, containing sewing kit. I also had a surprise for the grown-ups. For some time I had been turning over in my mind the question of drunkenness, and I wanted the people to appreciate the fact that it was not the mere drinking of alcohol which I condemned, but excessive drinking. It appeared that the native population had no experience of moderate drinking. The white man was in those surroundings as intemperate as the Indian. There was a law in most Canadian provinces which denied access to liquor to the Indian. Presumably, the white man had made the law in the interest of the native, but how had it come about that he had developed no sense of responsibility whatever for his own example in the matter? Nobody could see the logic of this question when I asked it. Another Canadian law which defeats its own aim is that forbidding the sale of liquor in a dance hall, as there may not be a bar for the sale of liquor in small quantities. The dancers bring whole bottles of whiskey with them, and they withdraw from the dance hall from time to sit in the car or the hay loft and empty the bottles. Someone had sent me a packet of lemonade crystals, and I decided to make cocktails for the party night. I wrote to the liquor store in Ashcroft for 2 bottles of gin, which came down on the open stage truck the next week, and did not escape the observant eyes of my pupils. However, the youths who visited me, hopefully for the next few evenings, were disappointed. Early the next Sunday morning, the Clinton taxi came skimming down the mountain road and stopped above the school. Seeing 2 men get out of it and take to the trail, I swept the crumbs off my breakfast table and refilled the kettle. A few minutes later, the driver was introducing to me the new police constable who had recently come to live in Clinton and was making his first visit to the valley. The 2 men regaled themselves on coffee and bread and butter and marmalade, and then I took them across to school to see the tree and the Christmas decorations. I could now ask advice about my plan for handing round cocktails at the party, but I must have expressed myself badly, because the constable interrupted me with a very stern expression. "Are you selling liquor to the Indians, madame?" he asked severely. The taxi driver threw back his head with a guffaw, and I said, "I certainly am not." I explained my purpose, and the constable said that the only occasion when it was legal to have alcohol at a dance was when it was a private party to which the guests were invited. So, on Monday morning, I hastened to impose on the children another exercise on writing invitations. On the party night, I went over to my house after the distribution of presents and came back carrying a big tray full of glasses of lemonade. The glasses were waxed paper beakers, each with a cherry floating on top and generously laced with gin. The children, of course, thought the treat was for them, and there were exclamations of disappointment when I said, "Grown-ups only." After the first sip, eyebrows were raised and dark eyes flickered, but no one made an audible comment. Grandma Grinder, who, I was told later, was a teetotaler, drained her glass without any discernible suspicion of what it contained. When the children could be persuaded to tear themselves away from the toys, and the refreshments and coffee had had time to settle, we were ready to dance. I was now familiar with the pattern of dances in the valley, and expected to stay up late. Around midnight, a stranger joined the party, a cowboy white man, whom I had not met before. The children brought him and introduced him as Ben, and he asked me to be his partner in the next square dance. He sat beside me between the dances, and I found his conversation very pleasant and entertaining. The children said to each other with apparent satisfaction, "Teacher's got a boyfriend." The revelers were always ready to dance until breakfast time, but I could not keep up the pace, and so about 3 a.m. I asked the MC to announce the last waltz. Ben suggested that he should come over to my house for coffee after the dancers had gone home, before riding down to his lonely cabin on the ranch. I agreed on the condition that I did not have to make fresh coffee, so we took the pail off the school heater. I locked up the school, and we went over to my cabin. Lila was there putting on her warm outer garments. She and Joe now lived in their cabin on top of the mountain, and she would have a long, cold ride. The next morning I awoke early to the sounds of unaccustomed activity outside my house. It was 7:30. I looked through the window and saw a wagon and team standing at the school door. So, supposing that one of the previous night's visitors had left something in school and was waiting for the key, I dressed quickly and went over to open the door. But I was wrong. Ralph and Floyd were there, and they said they had come to get some hay from the barn. I went back to prepare my breakfast. It seemed to take them a long time to load the hay. I was in and out of doors all the morning, fetching water and hanging out my laundry, but still the wagon stood at the barn. Then at last it lumbered off. The next time I went outside, my eye was caught by some little red specks moving about on the mountain side across the valley. I got out my binoculars and found that some of the children in their red shirts were playing up there. they were still there at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I suddenly realized that my house was being kept under observation. These incorrigible children were waiting to see Ben come out of it